small group of enemies, and some stayed around for a long time, like the Cheep Cheep. This simple little fish has been seen in a surprising amount of games, and also went through a couple of big changes. So today we're going to take a look at them and see how they changed in terms of story, use, design, and gameplay. The Cheep Cheep was first seen in the very first Super Mario Bros. As one of the enemies specially made for the underwater levels. There are two kinds of Cheep Cheeps in the game, a red one which moves fast, and a green one that moves slower. However, this could imply that the grey Cheep Cheeps were meant to be green, but appear grey due to the underwater palette. However, I'm not really sure about that, it looks messy for me. I'm colorblind. Interestingly enough, unused green Cheep Cheep sprites appear in the game's coding, so they're at least in the files. Now, that's enough color stuff for now. It isn't really my thing anyway. Let's take a look at the role of the Cheep Cheep. Well, like I said before when I did a video on the blooper, they just recreated the normal level setup, but this time underwater. The Cheep Cheep are the normal enemies with an overall predictable pattern just like the Goombas, and the bloopers are more challenging enemies just like the Koopas are on land. They are extremely similar, but still they feel and look different, and that's the trick. They could have made an underwater version of the land enemies, but then it wouldn't feel like a new challenge. So they created a set of underwater enemies, which essentially have the same function, but behave slightly different and look a bit different. And so the Cheep Cheep was born. However, there's one little surprise in their plan of attack. The red ones sometimes leap up from the bottom of the screen. So they're still a bit unpredictable and surprising at least. Now the next game in the series was a bit of a mess, since it wasn't really a Mario game, so a lot of the enemies from the previous game weren't seen. So no Cheep Cheeps here, sadly enough. But we did see them in the game after that one, Super Mario Bros. 3. Yeah, Nintendo is great at, names. Cheep Cheeps appear in the red and green variants, and they haven't changed a lot. Red ones usually leap out of the water and sometimes even lava, while the green ones swim back and forth. But that's not all. They were also planning to put in yellow Cheep Cheeps, which would move faster than the red ones and appear in trios. They were taken out of the game for unknown reasons, which is a shame, but it will remain a mystery. However, we did see a lot of cool variations in this game, and this is something they did with a lot of classic Mario enemies. It makes them more memorable and likable. It adds something to the standard enemy, a little twist. Like Baby Cheep and its mother Big Bertha, as well as the feared Boss Bass. They attack Mario and try to take him out. They have a bit of a mini-boss vibe, since they're incredibly fast and can take you out quite easily if you don't pay attention. All of a sudden, they are way harder to defeat and extremely unpredictable. So the enemy did a full 180 in terms of behavior. These ones are the complete opposite. Now they also added another variation, but this one is useless in my opinion. I'm talking about the spiny version. This one was only faster and the addition of the spikes was quite useless, since touching them does damage anyway. And it doesn't do any additional damage, so it doesn't really serve a purpose. In the next game, Super Mario World, we see the Cheep Cheeps again, but some things changed. This time they are also found in the air contained in floating bubbles, so they can attack from above and below. However, the ones in the bubbles don't do any damage. Slowly but surely, this enemy was used more and more. They even made multiple new variations, all with their own little role. Like Rip van Fish, a sleeping variety, and if Mario wakes one up, he will chase him. And if a charging Chuck blows his whistle, all the ones in the area will start chasing Mario. So this is actually a really cool enemy. It adds a bit of stealth and sneaking to the gameplay, since the player doesn't want to wake them up. Another thing this does is slowing the player down, which prevents them from rushing through the level and ignoring everything. The origin of this variation is also interesting, since they're based on a literary character named Rip van Winkle, a man with a Dutch heritage who fell asleep for 20 years in 1819. Now, this never really happened. It's fiction, but it did inspire this enemy. Now they added 3 more variations, 2 of which are pretty basic, and one that's quite special. One of the simple ones is the Blurb, which wear goggles for some reason and act the same as the green Cheep Cheep. And the other is the Fishbone, which is an undead skeletal version that appears in groups and is quite aggressive in terms of behavior. Now these 2 aren't very special, but the last one, the Porcupuffers, brings something new to the table. They act similar to the Boss Bass and Big Bertha, but this one has spikes. Now, like I said with the spiny Cheep Cheep, it's useless. But this is different in Super Mario World, since here you can do spin jumping, and with this you can jump on those spikes and a whole lot more. It has a purpose now. You can use it for platforming, so it's finally useful, and this enemy also follows you, so you can completely use this to your advantage. So overall, a great addition to the game. But after this, it all changed. The Mario world went from 2D to 3D, and this was bad news for the Cheep Cheep. In Super Mario 64, Cheep Cheep's a slow-moving fish who will follow the player. That's it. It's quite depressing. They were completely built around the concept of 2D, so in 3D they were completely useless and weren't a threat at all. Only Boss Bass, who also made a return in this game, was well designed. He had a bit of a Jaws vibe. So the Cheep Cheep took quite a hit. They weren't seen a lot in Mario 64, and a lot of their variations disappeared. In the 3D game after this, Super Mario Sunshine, we saw them again, and this time they were way more useful. There are 3 varieties of Cheep Cheeps. The orange varieties make huge leaps and can be defeated by either a jump or with fluid, and can also be turned into platforms by Yoshi's Juice. So this one is used as a bit of a surprise attack enemy, since they can jump up out of nowhere, and they're also used for platforming. A great improvement over the Mario 64 version so far. The pink ones will actively hunt Mario down, and if he gets too close, they will catch Mario in their mouths and drag him down into the water. So these are a bit like the Boss Bass, but this time you don't die straight away, but you can still drown. And then we have one that's found in the lava of Corona Mountain. They're a fire version of the enemy. So things got better for the Cheep Cheep. They found a place in the 3D games where they were useful and a fun challenge. And I have to say, this game was the best opportunity to reinvent this enemy. The entire theme was water and a tropical vibe, which is fitting for the Cheep Cheep. So they managed to revive them for the 3D Mario games, and in the next one, they did something really cool with them. Cheep Cheeps reappear in Super Mario Galaxy, acting the same as they did in the older games. So the normal variant didn't really improve. But that's not important for now. I want to talk about a boss. The King Fin, a huge fishbone that Mario has to take out. Now, it's actually quite challenging, since you have to keep an eye on your air meter and dodge all the attacks. But you also have to do some damage. To do that, you need to grab the shells and launch those at his jaw. Overall, a bit of a difficult task. But that's a good thing. A challenge can be a lot of fun. Only downside is, the boss itself doesn't really do anything but swim around. No, the smaller fishbone that he commands do all the work for him, which is a bit lame. A one-on-one battle with this boss is way cooler. However, this isn't the only Cheep Cheep boss. We have also seen another one, and this is the Cheep Skipper, who is seen in New Super Mario Bros., a 2D game. Now it looks quite cool, but to be honest, it's extremely disappointing. You just have to jump on it when it jumps up, and it has a bit of a Boss Bass look. It's basic, easy to defeat, and not impressive. Overall, horrible. Now after this, they mostly appeared in 2D games and also a 3D game, but nothing really changed. We only saw 2 new variations. The Eep Cheep, which looks a lot like the scrap yellow version from Super Mario Bros. 3, and the Mecha Cheep, which is the same in terms of behavior as the normal ones, only difference is, they're immune to fireballs. Now this is where it kind of ends in the main series for the Cheep Cheep, but they were seen in a ton of spin-off games like the Mario Party and Yoshi series. We even saw them in a completely different game series, The Legend of Zelda, so they have been seen quite a lot. They're a real classic, but one thing's sure, they went through quite a number of changes, being at the top in the early days of the main series Mario games, and ending up at the bottom in current titles. But hey, maybe they will get a bigger role in Super Mario Odyssey. Who knows?